I want to tell you, this is incredible. Look at all these people, and I got the hardest classes I had in high school was English. And I was the math and science kid, and I never thought this would happen. I want to tell you, when the small family asked me to start writing for the newspaper, I thought they were crazy. And I tried. I said I got maybe 30 stories. And I think last week's was 414. But we're here not about me tonight. We're here about that gentleman in the front row. I hope some of you have gotten to meet him, Walter Pieszka. Now, this is how fate happens. I am at my doctor's office getting my semi-annual, now I wish it was annual, but semi-annual physical checkup with Dr. Hayes, Philip Hayes, who unfortunately is going to retire on us come January 1st. So thank God all this happened beforehand. He says, I've been reading your columns. I got a guide. It's just the greatest story in the world, but I can't tell you about him. HIPAA, the requirements, you can't spread it. And his nurse, and I don't know if these were the exact words, it was like 5 years ago, says, I think you can. Mr. Pieszka's in the lobby out there waiting to give you a Christmas present. Well, let's walk out together. Hi, this is Dennis Marek, and we started out 5 years ago. I have tried everybody that I really like as an author to get to write his book. And the last one was actually the man that wrote Black Hawk Down, Mark Bowden, who was so kind that he called me to tell me he couldn't and wouldn't do it, but here's how you write a book, Marek. And thank you to my wife who gave me this time. The last funny story is the other night we were watching Le Carré. He's this 80-year-old writer, does all kinds of mysteries, spies and so forth. And he says, when you get done writing your book, you become depressed. And until you write your next book, she goes, no. So, that guy that ran the marathon, one and done? But how could you ever get a better story than this? I just, I left my book up there, so didn't I? She takes such good care of me. I am not going to take a lot of your time other to tell you that meeting Wally Pieszka has been one of the most amazing things in my life. I've been blessed to do a couple of great things. I walked into England, and the guys I was going to study with that year said, we got to go to Newcastle. There's this new band. For the price of beer, I saw the Beatles. So I've been kind of Forrest Gumpy a couple ways, meeting people and stuff. But to write this book with Wally was such a privilege. There are, I know, a million stories out there, and we've read some of them. But when I got done, I said, I got to write a column on you, Wally. And Wally goes, we'll do that. So I start writing, and my columns, they're like this long, right? I couldn't stop. So I go to my editor and I said to Phil Angelo at the Journal, I said, do you ever serialize or something? This is too big. He says, we don't do that. I said, okay, I'm going to give it to you. You cut it. He gave us 2.5 pages of the Journal that weekend. And I guess we were off and running at that point. Wally has just had an amazing life. I call him the luckiest, unluckiest guy. He shouldn't have been there in the first place, but then he survives. The book is all about him. It's really nothing in there that he didn't do, experience, or try. That was really him. There are 2 parts I don't understand about Wally. And the first one was, it was in England, he decides to all of a sudden come to the United States when he finally got what he wanted. He had a business going. I never understood that part. He can't explain it to me, and that's okay. Things happen. People do things. And the second one is why he would go to a union and tell them how well Wrigley treated them and they shouldn't go on strike. Now, that's flat dangerous, He gets called upstairs, as you see in the book, and he ends up, that's how he starts working for Wrigley. They hear about it, and they want people like him on their staff. Those are the only 2 parts of life I don't understand. The rest of it scares me to death, some of it, but I do understand it. When I was writing this book, I thought, how do you catch people's attention? And the story that probably sticks out in Wally's life so much is one particular night in Stalingrad when he's freezing to death. Hitler had not learned what Napoleon learned. He got in there and was totally ill-prepared to fight a winter war, and he lost. But before he lost, and 106,000 Germans and Romanians and Poles get surrounded and marched into Russia, of which only I think 6,200 survived, he gets himself wounded and gets out of there. And these are just some of the things in the book. So I decided to start with the night he's on guard duty in Stalingrad, freezing to death, midnight. He's not getting replaced on his watch, and that's chapter 1. Then we go back and kind of follow his life through. So I would like to read with you tonight part of chapter 1, but I got to tell you, there's a part in there that's in Polish. My Polish sucks. So what I'm going to do is when we get to those 2 lines, we've made real big print of it today, and Wally's got it, and he'll read the Polish parts for you. So I'll stop. You got it, right? Is good. No? What do you do with it? You got the print, the good print, Wally, of what you're going to say tonight? The Polish? All right, I'll bring him the microphone when it's time. We'll take a little break in the middle. I'll walk down. No, this is the medium print. So we're not as organized as we thought, did we? See if you can read this one. I had an extra one. It's a little smaller than the other one. But I do not try Polish. Try me. Yeah. So if you're ready, and I bored you to tears, let's maybe try reading a little bit of chapter 1 of your book. Because most of you bought a book, so it's your book now too. We ready to go? Let me find a place to put this. I guess you clip it on, and I'm not doing a very good job. Right, there we go. All right, chapter 1, The Ultimate Survivor. December 17, 1942. The German Army private stared at the clear sky in wonder. Could it get any colder? Could he get any hungrier? Could he survive another night, another day? Would he freeze to death tonight, tomorrow night? He had taken clothing from dead men for the last several days, wrapping around his feet and around his shoes and around his body. The quiet was deceiving. The Russian army was just a few hundred meters away. The private was standing about 10 miles west of Stalingrad. The battle for the Russian and the German army lines are all around him. He had been on duty for hours. It was 30 below zero Fahrenheit. He was not dressed for this kind of cold. He wore 3 shirts and 2 coats that had not been his only days before. He was still freezing, and he was still starving. His rations since September had been dramatically reduced. Food had been scarce for the last 3 months. He was now down to a single cup of wheat rice a day. It was hardly enough for a man, let alone a soldier fighting a battle, to live on and sleep in a hole in the ground at night. He had lost 24 pounds fighting this war already. Every part of his body itched. The lice had been with him since September. They had no salve, no medicine to counteract these bugs. He hadn't had a uniform change since September. The situation for the soldiers inside the kettle or cauldron in English, the name for the encirclement of the German troops, was desperate. The private had been near Leningrad since September, following a minimal 2 weeks of training in Germany after being drafted. He had traveled by cattle car to the Ukraine and then walked 6 weeks to reach Stalingrad. The private was Polish, not German. What was he doing fighting this battle? He'd been forced into military service by the threat of death to himself and to his family. Surrounded by German soldiers, he spoke very little German and survived by mimicking what the other soldiers did. While his uniform was the same, his poor German portrayed his true nationality, and he was treated with little respect. Surrounded by Russian forces for the last several weeks, the Sixth Army had been cut from ground supply whatsoever. Arms, ammunition, uniforms, and food were limited to the supplies that could be flown in at this point. 2 small airstrips were still available, but the planes were constantly attacked by Russian fighters. General Frederick Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, had called for 500 tons of supplies to be flown in a week, an amount that would barely support his fighting troops. The actual amount delivered was less than 150 tons a week. The entire German army was trapped. Their allies to the north were the Romanians, who had been overrun, and the Italian forces to the north of the main concentration had already surrendered. The time for retreat to the west or to the south had passed. General Paulus had suggested to Hitler several times for the embedded German troops to escape, but the Fuhrer had forbidden it. A retreat or surrender, either one. He could not accept that his war plans were being stopped by a bunch of Russian peasants. At 19 years of age, the private had been drafted, and now he was here, shipped to the freezing hell. He had never fired a gun before the 2 weeks of minimal training. Now he was fighting in the bloodiest battle known to the history of man. Stalingrad, the Soviet city, was in shambles. Russian civilians were fighting for their lives. Their homes were gone, and most had fled to the eastern side of the river. Some remained in the broken buildings and were fighting back. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet and Allied troops and Axis troops had already died. The civilian deaths would approach 1 million before the siege was over. They had died from bombs, fires, gunshots, artillery, or just starvation and cold. Before the battle was over in 1943, the city of Stalingrad would be 95% destroyed. The fate of the army was becoming all too clear to the foot soldiers as well as to General Paulus and his staff. Almost to the man, the soldiers suffered frozen limbs, filthy uniforms, inadequate winter clothing. They were so weakened that they could hardly move, let alone defend their positions. Morale was virtually non-existent. That was why the Romanians had been overrun. They just quit. The private stood his post, but he did not want to shoot anyone. He had no enemies in this fight. Every day the private had to pretend that he was a good German soldier, or he would be shot himself. He once saw General Paulus in person and heard a soldier ask the commander for more food. The general merely responded that he was also starving. Tonight, as he stood his watch, the private spoke aloud as a statement to the entire world. Now I'm going to bring him up here to give you the Polish. Oh, you got a mic for him? Super. There, sit right there. You're fine. No, right there. There's your mic.
Read that in Polish.
Mój kochany Boże, zmiłuj się nade mną. Zabierz mnie. That means, dear God, please take me from here and have mercy on me.
He added one line that's not in the book, but I think he actually said that night. These were the desperate words uttered by the half-frozen man. To speak Polish was forbidden, but he no longer cared. It didn't matter that it was allowed. There was nobody near anyway. The private debated deserting his post that night. He no longer cared about life, nor his, nor anyone else's. His extra long shift was ordered by the sergeant because he was not a pure German soldier. He had already stood his watch, and then he just walked away from his post. The private walked several hundred meters over the frozen dirt and debris to a hole in the ground covered with boards and branches. This was his barracks. Inside it had dirt walls and floor and offered a little shelter from the wind and was at least a few degrees warmer than outside, mainly from the body heat of the other soldiers in the hole. As he entered, the private was confronted by a sergeant. It was clear that he had left his assigned post. "You will return to your post," he was told. He stalled for a few minutes. While he understood the order, he did not have the German words to successfully argue with the sergeant about overstating his watch. The increase of only a few degrees in temperature and being out of the wind brought an immense relief. He was unsure what to do. If he refused to return to his position, he would be shot. Soldiers by the dozens were being shot by their own officers and non-coms for desertion or for merely refusing to obey an order. Chaos was rampant in the ranks. The private wavered. Die here or die by freezing to death outside? Which one? Did it matter? Death was death. It just might be a relief. Every human reaches a point where death seems the simpler answer. He finally decided that his fate was in his own hands. He chose to live, perhaps for only a few more hours or days, but he was going to try to live. Slowly, the private climbed back out of the dugout and began to walking back to his post. He wouldn't be relieved until 5 in the morning. He thought about 5 a.m. would be the time, and then an old saying flashed into his head. 5 a.m., the time when drunken men start to sweat and other men start to have nightmares. Well, he wasn't drunk, and there was no chance that he would sweat, but he was certainly about to have more nightmares. That much he believed. He had gone only 15 or 20 meters from the hut when he heard the roar of incoming fire. The sky lit up next to him. The explosion rocked him. Russian military had dropped a single shell right into the dugout where he had just been. All 5 of the men he had left only minutes ago, including the sergeant, were now dead. He hadn't really known any of them very well. They were all German, and he was that odd Polish-German soldier. There was no respect given for the foreign soldiers conscripted by force by the Germans. The foreigners were just more common cannon fire for the German war machine. The private had seen many die, including a Polish man he had known from home who died in his arms just a few weeks before. Previously, bullets had hit his helmet on 2 occasions, leaving him with ringing ears and a headache, but no damage. Once a bullet passed over his shoulder so closely that it burned his skin. This time, however, the private was seriously injured. His mind was fast becoming as numb as his feet. The last thing he remembered was the roar of the explosion and a searing pain in his right knee. He collapsed and fell unconscious into a ditch that was covered with deep snow. For the private, this wound became the first major event in his series of incredible survivals over the next 14 years. Whether watched over by God, or if he was one of the most determined men, or the luckiest men in the world, this private's survivability would continue for another 7 decades. His lifetime of ordeals was just getting started. Was he to become the luckiest or the unluckiest of men? That time would have to be told. This is a story of the lucky unlucky boy man, Walter Pieszka. Thank you. As you can see, it is filled with emotion. Some of the stuff was just hard to believe. Can you imagine being outside with a light coat at 30 below zero? No food. But you had your bugs. They kept you company. I will tell you one more thing in the book that I find the most disgusting thing in the world. When he's wounded, he's in a tent, and he has a man on either side of him also wounded. And Wally says, "You hoped that neither of them would die." And I said, "Well, of course." He says, No, you don't understand. If one of them dies, his body cools, and his lice joins your lice. Yeah. So that's part of the story. It's just amazing what goes on from there. And some what went on before that. Before that, he was forced to be a painter at Auschwitz and saw it all in 1939, 40, 41, before he's drafted. It's all in the book. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I'd be happy to, and Wally, I'm sure, would be happy to try to answer some questions without giving the whole book away, but we'd try. Sir. Well, I met him about 5 years ago, and so we did the early part with the column pretty soon after that. And then I tried forever to get people to write this book, and probably, Kathy, 3 years I've been working on it, we've been working on it. I have a couple other jobs I do, and so it was not as fast, but God loving me hung on for me so I could continue to make the corrections and get them right. Wally's 94. I'm 74, so I always know how old he is. I just add 20. It's been an experience. I hope I've been a good friend in all this to Wally. And, he lives in the country, and his wife has passed, as you'll find in the book. And his community has been absolutely fantastic for him, helping him. His son was a terrible man, grounded him. The car went away this summer. So I got to tell you, at 75, I walked in to get my new license. I'll be 75. I had to take a driver's test. When's the last time I was 15 when I took my last driver's test. So, I mean, I know what it would be like to not be driving the wheels and living in the country. His friends and his church members have been superb for him. So he got really lucky years later, but I had to get him in the United States to get lucky. He's been back to Poland several times. My wife and I went back 2 years ago and met some of his family there, saw where he grew up, went to Auschwitz, and that was part of learning how to write this book too. There's a guy in the crowd tonight that helped me a ton, and that's Jim Ridings, an author himself. And I'm sure he thought I was the stupidest guy in the world when I was asking all the questions, how you write a book and how do you get it published, and he helped me find a publisher. And I thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for being here tonight. It's very special. So what else? Anything else? If not, I appreciate your coming. My goodness, what a crowd. What a nice crowd. Way in the back. Oh, Mr. Nordmeyer. I know some of these people, you know.
Well, we've been also very blessed. One of the largest Polish communities in the world is located just north of us in Chicago. Paulina and I had the opportunity to go up there on several occasions and attend some of the churches there. And one of the things that we found is that they have a tremendous sense of community and fellowship within that community. And I was wondering if you ever had a chance to get up and visit that community, and what was your impression?
I have not personally done that. Wally, of course, was a part of that community for a lot of years. He lived mostly on the southern part of the city, moving a little bit south a couple of times before blessing. I guess there's three things that I don't understand. Bonfield after Chicago? That's, I don't know if Mrs. St. Germain is here, but he found Shirley St. Germain by accident and showed him all these places, and they had a chance to sell their house and be out in 2 weeks. She found a house with the person that died in the country, just what Wally's a farm boy, and he still lives there in the middle of cornfields, and she was a blessing to him. I mean, there were people like that through his life that made such a difference. You'll find coincidences in this book. When we were first talking about a title for this, we talked about coincidence of survival as a possible title. Decided maybe that was a little hard, people might not remember it. And so we came up with the ultimate survivor. And I was going to get that for my website, which I have not done, and found out somebody already has that name, but they could sell it to me for $2,000. I thought, we'll get a different website, I think. But so I'm learning from everybody on this. I truly am. It's been a trip. I mean, just to hold a book that you wrote in your hand is a real trip. And giving it to him was a bigger trip. Yes, ma'am.
So, what was it like to try to come to the United States, after the war?
It's in the book, but in a word, I think it was a freakish accident by a friend of his who wanted not to go to the United States, but to go to Canada, and they went down to London together, and he wandered into the American Embassy. And he had this business going. He always wanted to be a business owner. He had this business going of being a painter, and he left it. And, well, there's parts that are just I wanted to save for the book. But and then he said to me, well, why Chicago? And he said, all Poles come to Chicago. And pretty close. It's the second largest Polish city in the world. Yeah, that's what he decided, and then he did it. Yeah. One of the things I think I saw in Wally's early life was he never felt he had much control of his own life. He was forced to do that, forced to do this, forced to not do that. He met a nice Jewish girl, and it couldn't happen because Jews don't marry Catholics. And all these things, he was always told what he had to do for a lot of years. And I watch him kind of finally be able to make his own decisions. And maybe one of them was to walk off the post that night. That was certainly a decision. Come to the United States was a decision. So he started to make decisions for his own good purpose. And it's like growth. And I hope you can see it in the book, because I felt it in writing the book, that that's an experience. Some of us are luckier than that. No, everybody in this room is luckier than that. We didn't have a childhood like that. We didn't have our house burned down. We didn't, on and on and on. So We sent our men to World War II and a few of our women, but our houses were safe. Our food supply was okay. We had enough. Nobody bombed us at night. And you can't say that for the country. His mom's house, the last time, gets burned down by the Russians coming through Poland toward the end of the war. Lost it again. And they're living in the cellar. And Kathy and I were in that cellar because it's still the same house, rebuilt, lovely home now, but the cellar is the same. 3 people and an infant in that little bitty room, plus all the food, the beds, the stoves. Wow. It's a little different than the way I think most of us were raised. Anything else? Yes, sir. Doctor.
Could either of the Walleys comment on the Wrigley family and how that went?
Do you think you could do that? Can we get him a microphone? Tell him how you met Mr. Wrigley. Yeah, it's a good story.
Okay. About what?
Mr. Wrigley. How you met Mr. Wrigley and that whole, without giving away the book.
Well,
Yeah.
I used to work for Mr. Wrigley. Very, very good man. Was P.K. Wrigley, that was the first owner. Then his son took over, was very good, but he died. And of course, third generation he took up, and he gave up the business.
Yeah.
Well, I still got a contact with them, and I got you got a piece of paper?
What piece of paper?
Huh?
What piece of paper?
From a Wrigley.
Oh,
Well, I just got a little writing about the Wrigley, how the business going. You used to have a Catalina Island and a lot of property in Chicago. And I was lucky, I got the job, and I was very, very happy.
He also got invited to the Cubs games because Mr. Wrigley owned them, and he tells me every time he got the tickets, it rained. So maybe Polish people don't get onto baseball right away, but
Well, one thing, the Wrigley give an employee a good pension.
benefits, yeah.
Well, if you got, very few people got a job at the Wrigley. When I was one of the lucky one, because it was a union, and the union was on the extra money, and I says, no, Wrigley give us all the benefits. We don't need any. What we will pay for.
This was
And
at a
then-
union meeting, by the way. And that sort of turned it around for you, didn't it, Wally?
Well, and they've been group of the people that have been against me. By Monday, I come back to work as a janitor. They call me upstairs and offer me a job. And it's that I was almost 40 years as an employee.
There's a lot about the Wrigleys that you probably don't know. It's in the book that Wally was able to share with me. Mr. Wrigley did not plant the ivy on the wall. He actually planted some trees that died. and forget who it was that planted the tree, but it's a baseball name that I knew. Planted in the early 40s, and it actually is obviously still there today. So there's some interesting Wrigley stuff in the book. So anyway, this is what we got. Thank you ever so much for coming. I'm pretty blown away. We started this as a fun project. This book was for Wally, and now it's for 50 or 75 people right here, and who knows from there. Yes, ma'am.
And it was just an amazing, beautiful story. And I appreciated your faith in the book, Wally. Thank you for that. I know that was part of what got you through. And also the honesty in the book. It was just, it wasn't embellished in any way. It seemed like you were so careful to write exactly what he experienced. And I appreciated that too. And then the last chapter was just fantastic about life in Bonfield.
Yeah, he had quite a life in
epic.
Bonfield.
It's an epic. It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
That's the Cross family over there. They have love stored. And we've got some books over there in case you don't get one you want it. They'll have a few down there. I'm such a chicken, we ordered 200. Writing says, get 1,000. I said, I'm going to have 800 in my attic, you know. And he shakes his head. He's still shaking his head. I was wrong. Sorry. We're going to reorder as soon as we can. But thanks for being part of it. And you know, if somebody read the book, he said, good book, great movie. So who knows? Well, that's maybe our next. Thank you so much for coming.